Welcome to Jack 221 Ethics. So in this video, we are going to talk about the theory of utilitarianism. So this video will try to see the different types of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism class is a normative ethical theory that places the point of right and wrong on the outcomes or consequences of choosing an action over other action. So this is a normative theory. If you could still remember our first lesson, we talked about two different ethical theory. We have the descriptive ethical theory and normative ethical theory. When you say descriptive ethical theory, this is a review class. It means that that theory describes the action or the decision making, or yun, how will you decide on an ethical situation. While when we say normative ethical theory, it recommends how an ethical situation should be faced, or how would you act on a specific situation which calls for an ethical issue or calls for an ethical concern. So utilitarianism class places its focus on the outcomes of the action. So nakafocus siya kung yung gagawin mo na action, ano yung magiging resulta, ano yung magiging outcome niya, no? So it moves beyond the scope of one's own interests. And it takes into account the interest of others. It is very opposite doon sa previous lesson natin about subjectivism and egoism. If you could still remember our previous lesson, which are yung previous lesson natin, subjectivism and egoism, it centers or it focuses on the interest of you as a person, of the interest of the moral agent, while it differs from this theory, utilitarianism. Kasi sa utilitarianism, ang focus niya is yung benefit or yung interest ng nakararami. So it is about, yun nga, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Kung ano yung makakabuti sa mas nakakarami. So when we talk about utilitarianism, we will talk about principle of utility, of course, no? So we have two names that will appear instantly if you will try to research about this theory. So we have Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. As I've said, in utilitarianism, it is the principle of utility. We will focus about the principle of utility. And when we talk about principle of utility, yun nga, ang pinakamatunog or pinakasikat or what will appear first, two important names in the field of utilitarianism, specifically in the principle of utility. We have Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So ito sila, Jeremy Bentham at saka si John Stuart Mill. They are both philosophers. Mas nauna nga lang si Jeremy Bentham. Kasi si John Stuart Mill, yung father niya ay disciple ni Bentham. Ibig sabihin, yung father ni John Stuart Mill ay supporter ni Bentham. So mas nauna talaga si Bentham. Actually, si Jeremy Bentham, mga pioneering philosopher when we talk about utilitarianism. So he is a very important person in discussing utilitarianism. Bale, parang sumunod lang sa yapak niya si John Stuart Mill. And most of Bentham's arguments or most of Bentham's theories ay sinang-ayunan naman ni John Stuart Mill, but hindi naman lahat. So we will discuss later on their similarities and differences of ideas. Okay, so let us start with Jeremy Bentham since siya yung mas nauna, no? So Jeremy Bentham is an English philosopher who introduces the principle of utility. Siya yung nag-introduce ng principle of utility. He recognizes the fundamental role of pain and pleasure in human life. He argues that The approval or disapproval of an action is based on the amount of pain or pleasure brought about by the consequences. So Bentham equates good with pleasure and evil with pain and asserts that pleasure and pain are capable of quantification and it can be measured. So yun nga, kay Jeremy Bentham, he begins by arguing that our action as human are governed by these two sovereign masters, no? Ang tawag dito sa dalawang ito, yung pain and pleasure, are two sovereign masters. So these masters are given to us by nature. So lahat ng tao pinanganak na meron nito. Na lahat ng tao nakakaramdam ng pain at saka pleasure. No, so these two sovereign masters helps us as human being to say if something is good, of course, and if it's bad. And it also guides us kung ano yung dapat natin gawin. Of course, it is very common sense naman na kapag alam natin na it will cause us pain, iiwasan talaga natin, i-avoid naman talaga natin, no? So, and if an action or decision will give you pleasure, of course, we would want to do that or we would pursue that action. That is innate to every human being. Nga, no? So, principle of utility according to Bentham, it refers to the motivation of our action as guided by our avoidance of pain and our desire of pleasure. Sinasabi sa principle na ito na mga actions natin ay guided by these two sovereign masters, the pleasure and pain. Now, we make decisions based on the feeling of pain and pleasure. We approve or disapprove an action based on pain and pleasure. If an action will cause us pain, we disapprove. If it will give us pleasure, we approve. No? But of course, again, utility or utilitarianism focuses on consequences. Yun nga, if the consequence of a certain action will cause you pain, you will avoid it. And if that action will give a consequence na maganda or pleasuring for you as a person, then that is a good decision according to principle of utility by Bentham. This principle also refers to pleasure as good if and only if they produce more happiness and unhappiness. So this means that hindi enough na yung experience, in my experience mo yung pleasure. But also, we have to inquire whether the things that we are going to do will make us happier or will make us happy. So having identified the tendency for pleasure and the avoidance of pain as the principle of utility, si Bentham, gi-equate niya yung happiness with pleasure. He equated good with pleasure and evil with pain. Kapag pleasurable siya, maganda siya, or good, or it will cause, of course, happiness. Another thing that Bentham's principle of utility characterizes is that it asserts that these two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, are capable of quantification. Pwede daw ma-measure yung pain at saka yung pleasure. That is according to Bentham's principle of utility. In measuring pleasure and pain, as I've mentioned, kasi according nga kay Bentham, no, pwede mo daw ma-evaluate or pwede mong ma-measure yung pain at saka pleasure na nararamdaman, no. Bentham introduces his framework in determining or in evaluating pleasure and pain. And tinawag niya itong philosophic calculus. So itong philosophic calculus na ito, isa siyang framework that calculates the pleasure that some actions can produce. So in this framework, an action can be measured or evaluated on the basis of these criteria: intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, and its nearness or farness. So, measure mo daw yung pain or pleasure kung gaano siya ka-strong or yung intensity niya, gaano ka-intense, yung duration niya or length of the experience of pleasure, gaano siya katagal mararamdaman, yung kasiguraduhan, if sure ba siya or are you certain ka na mararamdaman mo or hindi, and the likelihood that the pleasure will occur or if mangyayari na siya agad-agad or hindi pa muna. So, itong mga indicators na ito or criteria, according kay Bentham in his framework, it will allow us to measure pleasure and pain in an action. However, when we are to evaluate our tendency to choose actions, of course, we also have to consider, according kay Bentham, fecundity, these two dimension, no? Fecundity or fecundity, and purity. When we say fecundity or fecundity, it is the chance of being followed if the action will be followed by another sensation of the same kind. For example, you have chosen or you've decided to do this certain action and the consequence is pleasure. Then, yung fecundity, if yung action ba ito is masusundan pa ng another pleasure. No? So, yun yung fecundity. But, when we talk about purity, it has the chance it has of not being followed. For example, you've decided on a situation and your decision's consequences is pain. Purity, ibig sabihin that action is hindi na siya masusundan ng another pain. So lastly, when considering the number of persons who will be affected or affected by pleasure or pain, another dimension to be considered is its extent, kung gaano ba katagal. So this philosophic calculus allows the evaluation of all action and the resultant pleasure. So parang this is yun nga, a framework. This means that our actions will be evaluated or ma-measure siya using these criteria, using this scale, no? So in this sense, pleasure and pain can only quantitatively, measure no number, differ but not qualitatively differ from other experiences of pleasure and pain according kay Bentham dito sa philosophic calculus niya. Now, class, dito natin masasabi or dito napapasok yung difference nila Bentham at saka Mill, si John Stuart Mill. Kasi lahat ng nasabi natin or lahat ng argument or ideas ni Jeremy Bentham about pain and pleasure, about our motivation guided by pain and pleasure, about good equals to pleasure and evil equals to pain, lahat yun sumang-ayon si John Stuart Mill. But dito sa framework na ito, na philosophic calculus ni Bentham, dito naman papasok yung disagreement ni John Stuart Mill. So, let us know bakit nag-disagree dito si Mill, no? So, ito nga yung idea ni Bentham na hindi siya nag-agree or gi-against niya or gi-oppose niya. Okay, so let us talk about John Stuart Mill's principle of utility and how he differed from Bentham. So, John Stuart Mill disagrees to the framework of Bentham, the philosophic calculus, kasi he thinks that the principle of utility must distinguish pleasures qualitatively and not merely quantitatively. Kasi for him, utilitarianism cannot promote the kind of pleasures appropriate to animals. He thinks that there are higher intellectual and lower base pleasure, may higher pleasure and lower pleasures. So we as moral agent, we as human beings, we are capable of aiming, of searching, and desiring higher intellectual pleasures more than animals are capable of. So we undermine ourselves, masyado nating ibababa yung sarili natin if we only and primarily desire halimbawa sensuality. Kasi this is because we as human beings, we're capable of higher intellectual pleasurable goods. Si John Stuart Mill kasi, for for Mill, yung lower pleasures such as sensuality, which are appropriate for animals, will be degrading to us as human because we are by nature not easily satisfied by this type of pleasure, this pleasure for, let's say, animals. So human pleasures are qualitatively different from animal pleasures. Yun yung point ni John Stuart Mill. So for him, it is unfair to assume that we merely pursue pleasures appropriate for animals, even if there are instances when we choose to pursue such lower pleasures. So to explain this, si John Stuart Mill, he recognizes the empirical fact na there are different kinds of pleasures. There are pleasures appropriate for human being and pleasures appropriate for animals. Again, John Stuart Mill argues that quality is more preferable than quantity. So, an excessive quantity of what is otherwise pleasurable might result in pain. So, we can consider, for example, our experience of, let's say, overeating or exercising. Whereas, eating the right amount of food can be pleasurable kapag sakto yung nakakain mo, but excessive eating may not be pleasurable. The same is true when we are exercising. So if the quality of pleasure is sometimes more important than quantity, then it is important to consider the standards whereby differences of pleasure can be judged. So may sinuggest si John Stuart Mill na test, no? So for him in deciding over, let's say, you are trying to choose over two comparable pleasures. Para sa kanya, para malaman mo alin doon yung dapat mong gawin, para sa kanya, it is important to experience both and to discover which one is actually more preferred than the other. So there is no other way of determining which of the choices you have except by experiencing them both. So para sa kanya, yun yung dapat gawin. If you are in a dilemma of choosing between two, the way in determining alin doon yung preferable is by experiencing it, by actual preferences and actual experiences. So yun yung gisuggest niya na test in specifying the quality of a pleasure and pain. Unlike kay Bentham na i-measure niya quantitatively, kay John Stuart Mill, iti-test niya, it is qualitatively. So, quality. So, yun nga yung sinabi ko, si John Stuart Mill, agree siya doon sa ideas ni Jeremy Bentham, but doon lang siya nag-disapprove or nag-against doon sa idea ni Jeremy Bentham na ang pleasure daw and pain ay pwedeng i-measure quantitatively. Kasi kay John Stuart Mill, it should be qualitatively. Okay? Quality. So, utilitarianism, according kay John Stuart Mill then, refers to the greatest happiness principle. So, it seeks to promote the capability of achieving happiness, higher pleasures, for the most amount of people. So, yun yung susunod na principle na i-discuss natin under utilitarianism. So, first, we had the principle of utility by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It talks about two sovereign masters that we have, the pain and the pleasure. And they differ in describing pain and pleasure. Kay Bentham, quantitative siya. Kay John Stuart Mill, qualitative. Okay, so let us move on to the principle of greatest number. In the principle of greatest number, equating happiness with pleasure does not aim to describe the utilitarian moral agent alone and independently from others. This is not only about our individual pleasures, regardless of how high, how intellectual, or in other ways noble our actions are. But utilitarianism, the principle of greatest number, is also about the pleasure of the greatest number affected by the consequences of our actions. It does not concern on an individual's happiness alone. When we say utilitarianism, since it is about consequences, when we talk about utilitarianism, nandoon palagi yung idea na in every action may it be may it offer pain or pleasure at the end of the day, or as a consequence. One of the most important point in utilitarianism is that it must benefit the greatest number. Okay? Dapat marami yung magbe-benefit. As I've said earlier, it is very opposite doon sa subjectivism and egoism, kung saan our focus is our self, diba? Self-interest. But in utilitarianism, we shy away with the idea na sarili lang natin. But this time in utilitarianism, to put it simpler, it's selfless. Every action you make should benefit the greatest number. About the pleasure of the greatest number affected by the consequences of our actions. In the principle of greatest number, utilitarianism cannot lead to selfish acts. As I've said, utilitarianism is very selfless. It is neither about our pleasure or happiness alone. So it does not talk about, it cannot be all about us. It cannot be all about our self-interest. But it leads to selfless acts. If we are the only ones satisfied by our actions, in utilitarianism, it does not constitute a moral good. If we are the only ones who are made happy by our actions, then we cannot be morally good. So yun yung sa utilitarianism. Kung yung actions natin is tayo lang yung magiging masaya, tapos yung nakararami is hindi magiging happy or hindi magiging favorable sa kanila, in utilitarianism, that is not considered morally good. So in this sense, utilitarianism is not dismissive of sacrifices that procure more happiness for others. It talks about selflessness. It does not lead to selfish acts. It's not always about you, but it is always about how many people will benefit, how greater the number of people will benefit from your action. Therefore, it is necessary for us to consider everyone's happiness, including our own, as the standard by which to evaluate what is moral. Also, it implies that utilitarianism is not all separate from liberal practices or liberal social practices that aims to improve the quality of life for all persons. Utilitarianism is interested with everyone's happiness. Gusto ng utilitarianism na lahat tayo masaya. Kaya nga, when we talk about utilitarianism, it is all about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Kailangan ang marami yung magbe-benefit. Kailangan marami yung masaya. So kung sa utilitarianism, if you're going to make decision, you have to consider na dapat mas marami yung makikinabang. No, halimbawa, in an hospital, may mga pasyente doon na magkakaiba ng case. Yung isa, kailangan niya ng limang dosage ng gamot. Pero yung ibang pasyente, tag-isang dosage lang. So, of course, you have to consider yung maraming magbe-benefit. So, doon ka, mas prioritize mo, in utilitarianism, prioritize mo yung maraming magbe-benefit. So, mas ibibigay mo yung natitirang dosage ng gamot doon sa tag-isa-isa lang yung kailangan kasi mas marami sila. Compare kung ibibigay mo yung 5 dosage yun sa isang tao na isa lang yung magbe-benefit. Again, in utilitarianism, in the principle of greatest number, ang concern natin dito in utilitarianism is the happiness of everyone. the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In every action that we make, we have to consider yung decision na mas marami yung makikinabang, mas marami yung magiging masaya. So it is very selfless. No? There's no room for selfishness. Okay, now for your assessment for this lesson, you have to answer this problem using, of course, the principle of utilitarianism. Limit your answer from 10 to 15 sentences. So the situation is this. It is noticeable before the pandemic, karamihan sa mga elected officials, mga ginagawa nilang projects, pinaka-common na infrastructure na ginagawa nila ay basketball courts, no? The reason behind this is that kasi maraming Filipinos daw ay fan ng basketball. So, most Filipinos are fans of basketball. Elected officials realize that building basketball court is more productive in promoting health than building hospital. Yun yung idea nila. So, is it justifiable to build basketball court because there are many basketball fans than to build a hospital because there are fewer sick people? Sa tingin nyo, justifiable ba yun na? Kasi mas marami daw yung makikinabang sa basketball court kasi mas marami yung fans ng laro ng basketball compare daw sa mga nagkakasakit sa hospital. So yun, mga elected officials, mas marami silang projects na basketball court. Now, you have to answer this problem. Justifiable ba yung act na yon na mas maraming basketball court na binibuild ng mga officials compare sa hospital? So, your answer must be based on the principle of utilitarianism. And as usual, you have to turn in your answer on the Edmodo assignment post. And I think that ends this discussion. Thank you so much for listening. And I am so sorry if I have posted this late than expected. So that's it. Thank you so much.